What is up, everybody? We are back. The Void Boys are at it again,
Yes.
bringing you another super hot fire of Seminar 1, Jacques Lacan, our boy.
Freud's papers on technique.
Freud's papers on technique.
The rolling papers.
Freud's rolling papers. Zigzags. That's the schema L. And today we are going to be talking about, what chapter is it? I'll say the name, but you can give the number because I've been working on the name.
Chapter 12.
Zeitlich Entwicklungsgeschichte. Zeitlich Entwicklungsgeschichte. If you say that 3 times in a mirror, Lacan will appear to you.
Yes.
Like, man.
And so pretty much what does it stand for? It's like the temporal subject's history, or the temporal development of the subject and its history.
Temporal develop of history.
Yeah.
I believe is how Google translated it for me. And I was so focused on the pronunciation that I might have neglected the concept. Entwicklungsgeschichte.
Yeah, but we have a dialectic there because it's like the subject being temporal, or what I was thinking, because it's like the temporal having to do with time and the subject's history. It's like a Heideggerian approach of like not only temporality being in time, but also like the historicity of the being in the world, or what would we be talking about? The subject, the unconscious, and the ego.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
Because I feel we may have placed historicity as a concept on the shelf, but we started this seminar with the notion of the historicized past, right?
Yes.
The subject past historicized in the present. So he reintroduces the concept, and it is back in full force.
Yes.
In this chapter, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to cover, but it is very eloquently and symphonically laid out here, all of the different elements that he's able to marshal together. And these are concepts that we've been discussing from the very start. And I feel like in this chapter, they really gain form as one.
And especially since like we really get into like some heavy stuff when Hippolyte like really wants to get a hold of like the structure of the optical schema and its correspondences to what we're actually focused on, the subject, the ego, these registers, you name it. So he's really putting Lacan up to task.
Yeah, Hippolyte is, of course, Lacan's primary interlocutor here, I would say. And he asks the most pointed questions. And here he wants some material specifications about the nature of the optical schema. I don't know if we want to digress too wildly here into this terrain, because I feel we've done a pretty good job at explaining all of the different nuances of the optical schema up until this point. But he does ask some very interesting questions. So it might be worthwhile to retrace our steps a little bit and try to figure out what Hippolyte's asking and how Lacan responds to the points he's making.
Yeah, and the main thing he's asking is like he wants more material specification of what this whole metaphor of the optical schema corresponds to for the structuration of the primary narcissism, or what situates and captive, or we're going to be using this term a lot, captation. So what keeps the ego or the subject, this metaphor of the eye, but we're not abstract eyes, but what keeps it in captivation in this image?
The lure.
The lure. Which, as we'll see with the lure, this spectacle, this gaze, or this gestalt has similarities not only to animals but also to us. But there's just something distinctly different that gets laid out in this lecture that shows that there's a loss of, as you'll say, like a potentiality in animals to go any further compared to the humans and their fixation on the lure rather than a lure or multiple lures, one could say.
So let's talk about the virtual observer. We know that the real image is, of course, composed of something real, a real object, which is the vase or the flowers, depending on which schema we're looking at. I think in this case, it's the vase that's real and the flowers that is the reproduction through the spherical mirror. And he switches it at a different.
Yeah. The main thing is that I think he even says in the last one, like either one will work. It's the fact that we never know what, we can only speculate that there is a real image, just that like there is a real body, but we never really know a real body, which of course this image as bringing it like down to earth to what we're talking about, the baby who is in the lure of their own gestalt is supposed to be the experience of one's own body, and they take that as their selves, their ego. And this is what gets complicated because you think like, oh, there must be a real body, but it's something that is out of one's reach, just like from the fact that this image alienates any notice of like what a real body could do. And I think he even points that out, or Hippolyte, like there's two bodies, the body that I feel, the real body, and then the body of like the image, I think he would say. But Lacan kind of corrects that. It says like, no, there's only one body.
And the body, which is primordially apprehended, is similar to the lure that the animal experiences. And for those watching, you can imagine that the eye is initially placed behind the upside down vase, the actual inverted bouquet set up here, in that it would be looking directly into the spherical mirror.
Yeah.
And I had to remind myself of this by going back to earlier chapters. But then at a different point, he switches the placement of the eye from here to here, where our good friend Arnold is, this cone of light.
And the plane mirror as well.
And then he introduces the plane mirror. So Arnold here is the eye, which he also calls the eye of science. That's the subject. And then the plane mirror, which adds another reflection to the schema and redoubles an already reflected image. And it's this specific image in the plane mirror which now transfixes the subject, and with which the subject identifies. But the subject does not only see the object of their own body, but also sees the subject in the mirror. Now, this can be confusing at first, because if you think about it from the point of view of me seeing of yourself, seeing the inverted bouquet and your own image in a mirror, you'd think, well, my body is myself, and then the inverted bouquet is an inverted bouquet. No, the point from which you see yourself seeing the inverted bouquet, which is your body, is the place from which the subject in this cone sees himself seeing, and understands it as a virtual subject. So the counterpart of the I that we initially encountered, that we needed to posit in order to understand anything involving the optical, is now doubled, right?
And I want to add to that is like, now thinking about it too, like he says, we're not an I, we're not an abstract I. So what he's trying to get at is with this optimal schema, like the I in and of itself outside of the schema doesn't exist or doesn't matter. And the I knowing itself can only do so through a mediation, which the plane mirror acts as to retroactively say, oh, I am looking at this image of the bouquet, or the I is looking at the image of the bouquet. I realize that, but it only through mediation, which we'll get our build up to. We'll be talking about the famous line that everybody's aware of desire.
Right. And at first glance, it's just keeping with optical terminology here. It's hard to understand how exactly desire would play into this.
Wait, you got to meditate on optics. That's the thing. You're not meditating enough.
You got to meditate on optics, not just mindfulness. Don't go into an Amazon Zen booth and think you're going to get out of it.
No Sam Harris meditation.
Meditate on optics. Don't let Sam Harris tell you shit. Don't listen to the opposite. You want to do some good for yourself, download that meditation app and do the opposite of everything he tells you to do. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. The virtual I, the virtual subject, but we're talking about something that we can't quite get at, and that's what's frustrating about the image of the virtual image is all we experience in reality. And I guess in a sense that there's this suggestion that the image is in fact an image and it is being doubled, and that it does fling us back into a state, or the promise of a state in which we were once whole. But the image itself tantalizes us. It seems out of reach. But not just because of what the image depicts, but because it depicts a point from which it's seen. And that's what I think is really interesting. And that is where the attempt at mastery comes in. From my point of view, the way I understand it, it's like you want to attain to that point from which you see.
Yes, the mastery of the point from which you see, not the mastery of the object, but the mastery of the point in which you perceive the object.
Which is like, what's fascinating about that is that you might think you want the thing that's in the image, but what you really want is the mastery of the act of seeing itself.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah. And this is the thing, it's like we're going to correspond these optical schema terms into what psychoanalysis is about, naming your desire. And there is no meta language, so it's like that's another thing. There's no meta I, just like there's no meta language, there's no meta vase, whatever. It's all contained. It's all like referential.
You're right. Exactly. Like mutual referentialities, if that's a word, like mutual references. There's this the reflection of a reflection is a very hard concept to grasp, but it reminds me of the dialectic, because the dialectic isn't something you can picture, and yet optics helps us understand it, which is kind of the irony here, right? It's like we're using optics to understand something that cannot really be visualized, but is best expressed in visual terms, strangely enough.
Yes. And that just shows that like there's a visual aspect to language or to metaphor, you know, rather than being literal, there's this visual imagery into speaking about something in reference, like rather than trying to create literal terms like positivist bros.
Right, who want to just like hook something to a referent. But what's really interesting about that is I think it's Saussure who calls the sign an audio image.
Yes.
A beautiful way of describing what the signifier signified coupling is.
I really have to read Saussure.
Yeah, just read him backwards, and then it's like signifier over signified. You know what I mean? That's how it works. Because it's like just reverse everything he says, and then you have Lacan.
Yep.
So that's a little trick for everybody who wants to read Lacan. You could read all the seminars and spend 20, 25 years of your life, or just read Saussure backwards.
Then you got function and field right there.
You got function and field right there. It's like the Beatles album back. What is it, Sgt. Pepper? Or
oh yeah.
Beatles album supposed to be like satanic. So Hippolyte, being a Hegelian, brings in this phrase Gegenbild. I don't know what the sexual replica of the ego is in Hegel. I tried to look this up, but I only got German sources, so I don't. Maybe you know.
Yeah, it's something that I'm not really familiar with either. I've never seen, like, at least in the phenomenology of spirit or anything like that. I don't know if this is something that in Kojève that I missed. I would say this is like maybe again something that you would see more in Freud, and this is like a Freudian Hegelianism of the finding of a sexual object in this the theory of sexuality. I could be wrong, but it sounds more like that, in which it replicates itself outside of itself in this desire for sexual satisfaction. That was a tongue twister.
But he says it implies this correspondence with Innenbild,
yes,
Innenwelt and Umwelt, inner world, outer world. And he's going to say, Lacan, that is, a little bit later on, agreeing with Hippolyte, that animals are libidinally fixated in such a way that the imaginary structurations of this lure are predetermined, and the animal remains at that level. And doesn't he say at another point that the animal is a jammed machine?
This is something that he'll bring up in seminar 2 to elaborate on why psychoanalysis can't be a humanism, and the introduction to the death drive, which he'll specify more as death drive rather than in here the death instinct. And he situates that more into the symbolic, because he's playing off of something of a lecture of Claude Lévi-Strauss he gives in on the elementary structures of the family and kinship. But in this way, what he's trying to do is really elaborate on the way that the symbolic itself functions. And there's these breaks, just like a break in a machine, but like the way you break, the way a machine will break or kind of, in a sense, malfunction, always leaves room for like a troubleshooting to repair itself. I think in this way, this is like during the time where he's like studying like cybernetics, and not to get too far off, but he sees in some way, rather than elaborating this thing of death instinct from the reference of imaginary to the symbolic rather than the symbolic itself, and to see how the way desire is structured like a language, it is in itself machinic, and that through these breakdowns and processes, it also sublates itself.
Because it's, as you often bring up, at this point for Lacan, the death drive is located in the symbolic, no?
So yes, he'll locate in seminar 2 the death drive in the symbolic, in which in seminar 11 he locates drive in general, not just death drive, but just drive in the real, like the encountering with the real. It's not that the death drive is always repeating itself, but there is, in this sense, and where you're referencing itself, because death drive will try to master itself. It has no choice but, and my interpretation of it could be wrong, but it seems like what he's saying is like, in this constant mastery, you see how there are these holes that lead to the encounter of the real. The real, not something that is just this thing in itself, but rather part of, like, I think you were mentioning this too when we were having our discussion about the real, that it's literally, in the Zizek meme that I made, it's like the real is a part of the structure itself. These deadlocks, these holes in the scaffolding, these things that, like in any type of foundation, allow for its weakness, its focal point.
And during our conversation with Brian Becker, he pointed out how the real actually figures into the discussions, the arguments of seminar 1 more than is commonly assumed, and it actually has a pretty active role here, although it isn't named as often, but it is an established register.
Yes, and I think right now it's just so confused because, like, he's always bringing up the symbolic, but it's like he only gives it a function with speech, and he hasn't really developed signifiers or signifieds yet and how they can operate to create the symbolic scaffolding.
Right.
It seems more of like we're talking about like these different images, and it's like what allows the structuration for these imaginary relationships. And it could be the fact that, one, we're seeing Lacan develop from his phenomenology, the imaginary Lacan. Because again, with phenomenology and any type of knowledge, I noticed you mentioned the thing about the imaginary contradictions that biology fails at, to where it can't really think outside of these, like, I mean, you didn't use this term, but I kind of elaborating off of it, like this imaginary biologizing, because the imaginary can think of like as idealization. And we could see phenomenology, especially not just in Sartre, but like Merleau-Ponty, of just like Gestalt par excellence. It doesn't question the structuration of the gestalts, the totality, especially in reference to the body.
Takes them as a given.
Yeah. And
also doesn't really distinguish between image as such and what an image is an image of, in a sense. I don't know. That's just a thought that came to me. I don't know if that's relevant to what you're saying.
Well, I think that there's some potential in the phenomenology of Heidegger that you'll see him use a lot more, or reference more, even if his name doesn't come up as often as somebody like Sartre, but just the understanding of not just like the Imwelt and the Umwelt being in the world, but referentialness of things, because Heidegger talks about signs and references as well. Like these images are a reference to something. It seems like these lures have a structure.
And the lure for the human animal is this anticipated seizure of mastery. Now, what I like about this specific articulation is not just that we're talking about mastery, but the anticipation of mastery. And anticipation, let's not ignore this word here. Anticipation is going to be actually a very central feature of what it means to be human and to exist between this interplay between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, because this is an important word in that it introduces the temporal element into all this, I would say.
Yeah, and thinking about that's like, we could think about it as like I don't know, like I see myself in, I don't know, 5 years. I desire so much to like have a job and make 6 figures. That's in a sense this imaginary anticipation of mastery, like my position in the way that I see myself desiring and having that satisfaction, having the thing.
Which is interesting because it's like the idea of embodying everything that correlates to the ego ideal is not having those things so much as what it will disclose.
Yes.
What it will bring you, which is that bodily mastery, where you'll be one with this sense of one with this mastery. And I think the other element to point out, though, is the seizure of mastery. It isn't just gaining mastery, but also gaining mastery of mastery. This is where the strange dialectic of it comes in. This is where it gets complicated. It's not just being the master, because being the master is never just being the master. It's the mastery.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I just wanted to point out that I really like the fact that he says we come upon Jacques Lacan's classical mirror phase, and he refers to himself in the third person with first and last name.
Yeah.
He, at this point, he already knows that he's associated with the mirror phase, and it's a testament to his dedication to psychoanalysis and exploring these ideas, in that like he wants to innovate the mirror stage.
Yeah. Well, apparently he didn't even come up with it. It was like some other mirror stage. It was like, yeah, Todd McGowan says like it was some other French dude, like some French thinker, but like he just elaborated on more and like take the credit for it.
Great artists steal, as they say. So desire is first grasped in the most confused form, and he here brings in Hegel. Lacan doesn't often mention philosophers or thinkers or psychoanalysts in a good light, but here he is not shy about his debt to Hegel, as we often mention, via Kojève. And he also talks about the structure of the idea of labor, which is really interesting, and how the master-slave dialectic is at work in this idea of labor, and how central it is to civilization itself.
Yes. And like, I mean, you could be metaphorical about it, because this is like more of like some type of like myth of subjectivity, especially for Hegel, but like in the sense that like the slave or the bondsman, or was it Todd McGowan said, the original translation is like hair and connect, that the connect, or the bondsman is the one that has more grasp with reality, and the fact that it is doing all the work, living off of the master's recognition, the Lord, and doing the Lord's work. But really, it has more of a grasp in change, whereas really the master does nothing but survive off of the fact that it's being recognized as a master by the slave and nothing else.
Right, which just reveals the dubious position of mastery.
Yeah, and this is something that in the introduction of Kojève's like lectures on the phenomenology of spirit, he'll say the same thing, like the master is just somebody who survived from a almost approach with death, but the slave just happens to be the one who gave up in this battle of life and death, and then just survives off of the recognition of the master's desire, doing all the work for the master. But this master is like really not doing anything at all, just kind of passive and getting its needs met. But really, it doesn't have pure needs because it needs the slave. And the slave is got the one that's creating history through this intersubjective relationship through labor.
Let's earmark that, because something just occurred to me that might have a resonance with another comment that Lacan's going to make a little bit later on. But here we have, the recognition of desire in the body. He's going to explain the sort of heterogeneity of this desire and why it doesn't have that one-to-one correspondence between imaginary structuration and the animal's attempt to reach its objects of desire. But there's something else I wanted to point out here. So he takes it as a fundamental given that there is this distinction between consciousness and our body, and also that the animal does not need to, as far as we know, represent its corporeality for itself in order to exist, in order to preserve itself. And I thought that's a really fascinating idea, is that, our own maladaptation, let's say, as comparatively weaker creatures in the animal kingdom, perhaps necessitates, just for the aims of self-preservation, the production of this image of ourselves, but it gets caught up in the fragmentary, and I don't want to jump too far ahead because you're about to say this, but it gets caught up in the fragmented desire. Actually, we're right there. The fragmentation of its identifications. And it's almost like a dysfunction that preserves us, but also spells our destruction. And it's only through the elaboration of these destructive impulses that we can even hope to preserve ourselves. That's the strange sort of contradiction that is being human.
Definitely, yeah. These symptoms, pretty much. Because I mean, if we really we bring it back retroactively to the very beginning of these entire lectures, he says that the ego is like the most privileged symptom of the human. That's what makes us human par excellence. But now we're getting to the elaboration of what this symptom really means, or really shows or functions as. And we have this like conglomeration of idealizations. I think in the beginning, you even had this question, like, what is like this whole thing about the idealization of, what was it, like these networks of the nucleus of, I think you said repression, or of the
pathogenic nucleus?
Yeah, pathogenic nucleus, yes. And it's like, here now, it's like we're coming in full circle. We're getting a better grasp at it.
What is a pathogen but something that makes you sick too? It's a very apt metaphor, because it's also a kind of, it's a kind of sickness. And what is sickness? Our sickness is being human.
Yeah, and I mean, think about it like in the Kierkegaardian sense, like the sickness unto death.
Yes. Yeah. One of the dopest titles ever for like any philosophy, for sure. But it makes me think of how people are like, oh, the human race is so evil, we're so horrible, we do these terrible things. And Of course we do. That's so true. But like in saying something like that, there's a kind of separation that you sort of a surreptitious kind of distancing from being a part of that, as if to say that there's a human symptom, but it could have been resolved. It doesn't touch me.
And it's kind of like, again, since we're in this is definitely going to bring it back into like our discussion, but like I think this is the interpretation as far as Hegel's beautiful soul though goes, like those who try to stand out from the human condition and the tragedy of evil in the world and its problems boiling down to a metaphysical conception or trying to align it with something that can be a meta language or a presupposition. Either it's like you look at it in the Greeks, like the Greeks believe that evil was like, well, Socrates said like no man that knows himself or has knowledge can really do evil. Like, those who aren't ignorant can't do evil, or like Plotinus and Gnostic would align it with matter. Just matter is just intrinsically evil.
And those would seem like two different views on the matter, but there's like they're both wrong for.
It's like one has to know the soul and stand outside of matter to be able to say that evil is located in this and I stand above it, or just the fact that I have this knowledge and I know I'm not ignorant to be able to say like, where does evil come from?
And later we're going to talk about not where evil comes from exactly, but how someone could act unconsciously, what it means to act unconsciously. Yeah. And neither Socrates nor Plotinus had any notion of the unconscious in this sense. So there's so much here to potentially talk about, but I like this sentence here that a fragmented body is an image essentially dismemberable from its body, in the sense that, if I'm reading it correctly, the subject feels like the fragmented body can be separated or discarded from the image it hopes to embody, the perfect image it hopes to embody. Again, we have this like working of fragmentation that almost seems to like the body further fragments itself in its attempt to attach these various fragments to symbols, as and this is something Zizek often talks about, which is like the prosthesis, and how, and it can get into the realm of like science fiction, cyborgs, for example. It's like that man, the human, necessarily needs to supplement its being with something technological, as if to complete itself, because the body is all, it's not just the body is not enough, but the body is not whole in itself, and man is viscerally aware of this lack of wholeness.
Like one, I got two metaphors. Like one is like, or like analogy is one, like you would need, if you look in the mirror, you only see yourself, like the front of yourself, right? You would need another mirror to mediate seeing behind, but you don't get a totality of like one three-dimensional image of your entirety. What you get are two separate fragments that you're retroactively bringing back and forth to create this imaginary gestalt of yourself. Another thing to even further the elaboration, this is why I love gym metaphors, we're seeing ourselves in fragments. Like Monday, I do chest and triceps, man, because I got to get my chest and my triceps big, because I don't have a big chest. I identify myself by these fragments, images that, man, I have a good back, but my chest is just freaking bird cage, like bird chest. I got a bird chest, so I got to get that huge. Or like, leg day. It's just like you're fragmenting your body in various activities.
It's a form of dismemberment.
Yeah.
This word that,
and there's a spectacle to it, because bodybuilding is all about aesthetics. There's no functionality to it. It's all about the looks.
So we dismember ourselves and then we reconstitute ourselves through the image. What we find lacking in the image, we say almost applies to a different body, whereas our mirror image often blame the mirror for the feelings of inadequacy, but it's actually what the mirror seems to contain that we can't get at. What belongs to us, what we take with us, is everything that the mirror image seems to have mastered. But yeah, we're the body in parts.
Yes.
And having just read the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, I'm not, as of yet, I haven't neared the illusory mastery of being able to talk about concepts involved. But there is definitely, for me right now, having read that, like some
partial body parts, partial images, but it's like they have like potentiality in these partial objects, whereas like for here it's like these partiality makes us lack. To them it's like, no, these partial objects are productive. Like I don't know, like the partial objects of the hand, like or the hand and the shoulder, the arm, like yeah, maybe like I have small arms like compared to like a bodybuilder, but it's like I assemblage on the fact that like I have good mobility to be a good baseball pitcher or something like that. So there is this like assemblage rather than like yeah.
And this sense of, to bring desiring machines into it and flows, is that each dismemberable part has its sort of its aim, it's what can be realized in it through its production, through its development.
Yeah.
But it's also a development that in capitalistic terms is endless, boundless, has no acephalous. It has no end point, because you can endlessly get stronger and you can endlessly reconstruct the body. And that's when I find it really interesting when someone's like, now that is, those are abs, that's a body. It's like you say something is more its platonic ideal when it's more developed, and it's as if it's less developed, it has less of the being.
Yeah, and you can still get that as far as like capitalist discourse in the Lacanian sense, but something that came to mind is like, yeah, like maybe you're not somebody who has that and you have this platonic imaginary of like what the ideal body looks like, but machinically in the Deleuzian sense, it's like, well, you're productive with your hands because you're like, let's say like this person is literally like a really good secretary, or like good at like typing up like so many emails and instructions for whatever like corporate company they work for. The partial drives that are productive with the hands to assemble onto the computer machine to produce the administrative machinic structure of, let's say, Google or something like that, which is a molar organism or a molar machine in capitalism.
So I don't know if we can directly relate that to.
I think it just contrasts.
I'm just, and I apologize to anybody who feels like we have digressed too far afield of like what we're talking about, but I'm trying to just relate it back to.
Yeah. And I think you were right though, like as far as seeing it platonically.
When we're talking about the body and like these desiring machines and like the different parts and how they almost are taken as like acting independently of one another. It's like, I mean, think about it. Our problems all accrue to the status of the body and how it eventually rebels against us. Norm Macdonald has a joke about that where it's like a heart attack. It's like you could do everything right and eat right, and then your heart attacks you.
Yeah.
It's such a terrifying thought that like you could be attacked by your own heart when you avoid dangers in the outside world, but it's something that is inside you that could potentially attack you. So you can't have that mastery.
Yeah, like
Look,
you could really like have your financial shit together. You have like, good credit, like you have a good house, a good marriage, but you got like an autoimmune disease and like your diet affects you. Like you're literally getting sick like every month, like you're like every other month. You already caught like COVID like so many times. Like
so we have this really interesting phrase here. I must have read this like 5 times because it seemed like he said the same thing twice, but no, there's a subtle passage from one idea to another here. We have the libidinal captation as a remediably fatal significance for the individual, insofar as it is subjected to the X of eternal life. What I took this to be was similar to this germplasm, the libido, death drive, and how this to me also relates to what I don't think we highlighted this before, but what he says, quoting Hegel, that the individual stands to this species as something dead to something eternal, and we are dead in relation to the eternity of the form that all of our activity sort of aims at realizing in some sense. I don't like the way I just phrased that, but
yeah, and what pretty much is like, I think with this germplasm metaphor, it's like showing this internal substance or immortal substance is definitely like it's the what makes me understand is the undead of what Zizek talks about, like what death drive is. It's something that's undead, like a zombie type thing. It's neither living nor dead, but undead. And it's like this, because if it's a death drive, it leads to this ultimate enjoyment of its own undermining, its own destruction. It aims at itself. So it destroyed itself, but yet this dialectic sublates it into a different form. And I'm probably going to bring it back to like a more like, I think the best way is the Marxist sense, or like what we were mentioning in the voice chat about Althusser of overdetermination. This, the fact that this unequal contradiction of the death drive or of social formation, in which these revolutions in America or in Britain that destroyed feudalism or destroyed the king didn't do away with. What they did was its own feudalism's own destruction or its own death drive undermined it, but yet with the material conditions, this unequal development, which sublated the contradictions of feudalism into capitalism. And that's why maybe now you could say like, oh, we live in feudal capitalism. It's more technocratic capitalism or technocratic feudalism. It's the same thing. That's like this inequality of like the fact that's like, oh, it's unequal contradiction. The fact that the modern proletariat works more hours than the serf did in traditional feudalism.
Right. And to that degree, it's like we see, because, we're so caught up in this logic, kind of liberal logic of progress, that we can't see how through this sublative process, no one specific aspect that's taken up by, let's say, like a paradigm shift is ever truly eliminated. It's kind of like it's like an unconscious, it's like the unconscious in that sense, in that like for the unconscious, it's like almost as if nothing is ever really forgotten. Everything is really inscribed into what I can't say, but into this dialectical dynamic. And what's frightening about that, what's frightening about the thought that there's something that's outside of our grasp and might reveal itself. And now I think we're like really kind of meandering a little bit here, because I don't know if I'm addressing exactly your point, but this is just me
No, you can go ahead because I got something
following
to
the
elaborate on.
branches of like what I'm saying, but like this idea that like if we're subjected to the X of this eternal life, it's as if the captation, which appears to have an intentionality, or at least in the way we target it with a certain intentionality, as a primary lure, does not ultimately, obviously, engender what it promises, but only serves this X of eternal life, which is the drive that is self-engendering. And then he brings it to the level of the symbolic here, where it's constrained to pass through an imaginary stage where it becomes something else. And this is where I think the element of mastery really comes in. But I don't know how to relate that directly back to what you were saying about sublation and society and feudalism, but I don't know. Is there any
now that you said something like the way the mindset of neoliberalism goes, it triggered an association of the way ego psychology and CBT simps act like is like, oh, this, and not even that, but the way you hear it in like corporate talks about self-help and ways to make yourself a better leader, like different health techniques. And what is one thing they say? Oh, stress is normal. There's an adequate amount of stress that we can endure because it makes us stronger. It makes us more efficient. Just like not all the time anger is bad. Like sometimes like, you know, a little bit of anger is good because it motivates you just to get your work done. So that way you finish your task at the end of the day. But the reality is that like, no, it's not like this synthesis or progress that's just going to make this totalized subject, totalized individual. A way we could talk about this like overdetermination or this sublation of this immortal substance is like the death drive or death instinct as it plays out in addiction. Somebody was addicted to heroin for all their life. Then they go to like Narcotics Anonymous, right? They learn like the 12 steps and they're learning some CBT from their counselor, or maybe they even go to some therapy where they go over DBT and CBT and how to make them more productive, more healthy, and exercise their behavior so it's beneficial for their well-being and other people. But then really what happens is the core issue of this jouissance or enjoyment is not the fact that they were addicted to heroin, but there's some type of traumatic kernel of lack where that jouissance in the substance really brought this nostalgia of a totality, of a false or a missing object. So then that gets overdetermined and sublated into something else. Maybe they become an alcoholic, and that comes worse because, you know, heroin's bad, but then there are some heroin addicts that just like, yeah, I got heroin. And then they become a huge alcoholic, and that actually has more health problems, and it's harder to fight. Alcoholism is probably the worst thing to be addicted to, like besides like any other drug. I would say maybe heroin was the best thing, but maybe like meth, because I've seen a lot of meth addicts like become addicted to alcohol, and they can't smoke weed because it gives them paranoia, you know, so they're just like, oh, I'd rather get drunk, and then they become an alcoholic.
So maybe a better way to approach recovery is to assume that it will be sublated into something proportional. But what that something is, let's say if it's a signifier in a sense, is going to determine, well, whether you live or die.
Yeah, and the way the I think he's like a therapist, but he's like more of a physician. He has a book called The Hungry Ghost, Gabor Mate, who specializes in addiction.
Oh yeah, I know Gabor Mate.
Yeah, he asks like not why the substance, but why the pain, why the trauma, and he talks about like this feeling of wholeness and satisfaction. Not in the sense of the Lacanian sense, but I see a good parallel to it. It's at least something easy to kind of piggyback on to make this kind of make sense. But the way the child wishes for this warmth and totality, and what he talks about, is very similar into the way of this going back to this nostalgia of a primary narcissism that never was. Not to say there was no primary narcissism, but the fact that when we reflect back on this totality that never was, because it's really just fragmented, we do things that undermine ourselves for the ego ideal to get the ideal ego.
And that is inevitable. And I think that leads us to the second part of what he says isn't fully made out in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is that the death instinct, as he's calling it at this stage in his theory, is that which aims at its own destruction, but not for the sake of returning the subject to a sort of nirvana of non-existence, but to regenerate itself. And that the promise of mastery is in itself what leads to failure. Because think about it, it's like once we reach a stage, once we reach a goal, people who spend their entire lives trying to win an award or gain a title or just be recognized by the adoring public, let's say, once they get to that point, they often experience the greatest depths of depression.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, the common explanation would be like, well, you know, they've lost anything to live for. And that's true, but it's like, that is the drive is trying to propel you towards getting to the point where you reach titular, let's say, mastery, ostensive mastery, only because mastery is impossible. And that is when you fall off. That is the precipice of mastery. So the whole Fort Dot thing is not so much about like, oh, well, eventually the child will reach mastery. It's like the child is trying to undermine its own, the drive is trying to undermine its own attempts at mastery. And that's the point of mastery.
Yeah. And that's funny, like thinking about like at a certain point in trying to gain this mastery of, you're talking about like, if I'm not mistaken, like, you know, trying to get an award or like get like a degree. And then once you reach to the quote unquote the top, there is no, even in the sense, what did you say, the mastery of mastery?
There's no mastery of mastery.
Yeah. And when you get that, you realize like how more responsibility it is, especially like if it's a corporate position, the amount of just overall responsibility, or the fact that you just don't feel it. There's no thrill, and it just becomes depressive. And it makes me think of like something that we can all relate to is the fact is like when we are kids, we idolize adults, right? We can't wait to be them. They feel like they're just like, you know, the subject's supposed to know, they know how to live, right? We assume that because we like are, you know, in this master slave dialectic with them. But then when we're teenagers, we're like, you know, fuck high school. Like, you know, I just hate my teachers. You know, they don't know crap. You know, life is meaningless. But then they're like, I can't wait to be adults. Then they become adults and they're like, man, I wish I could be a kid again.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you see this like in the mood of, I mean, maybe you use like late stage capitalism, postmodern society or whatever. It seems that a lot of our generation expressed the fact of wanting to be whole again or being the kid because it was so much better. And the fact that the commodities they consume as far as entertainment are mainly cartoons now. More people watch anime because it brings that adventurous totality of what it's like to be a kid. This came to mind when I was having a conversation with Michelle from OG Rose, and I mentioned this. It's like, if you think about anime, it kind of brings that nostalgia of being a kid or what friendship is like, the idealized of friendship. But we never had perfect friendships. Our friendships are kind of, you know, imperfect, asymmetrical. We lose friends, we get betrayed by people, you know, the whole 9 yards. But putting ourselves in the virtual object of animation in general, it brings this like feeling of, oh, what it was like to feel whole.
And it's funny because it's Freud who I believe talks about the sorrows,
like mourning and melancholia.
but the sorrows of childhood too, is that childhood itself, it was not this Edenic state at all. I mean, look at a baby. Babies they can be happy, but they're also just, if you hear a baby crying, it's awful to experience, but not just because of the sound, it's just the reminder that just being human is abjectly horrible a lot of the time.
Babies on an airplane.
Yeah, because you're like, this thing's not supposed to stay in the air, and now I have to listen to creature wail. But that was, I think we were spitting there, but he pretty much says all this, everything we were kind of getting at. But what's really interesting is I like how he says that the idea of nature in relation to which man portrays his original inadequacy to himself, which he expresses in 1,000 different ways. So I love this portrayal of us as human beings as premature, as we came into the world too early, just like the subject comes into the world is either too early or too late for everything. And that's how we experience desire, and that's how we experience the different stages of our lives, as things happening too early or too late. And we can't not but experience them in this way, whereas nature itself appears to have this sort of self-engendered, self-enclosed perfection and wholeness that is, even the way people talk about the climate crisis, right? It's like they'll say, well, don't worry, well, like, yeah, we'll be wiped out. I mean, this is true. It's like, we're going to be wiped out, we'll be extinct, but the earth is very resourceful and will regenerate itself, and don't worry, like Mother Nature and all the other creatures on earth will be like, as if there's something, as if we weren't produced from this very same process that created all other forms of life. You know what I mean? And in the sense that, again, this goes back to what I said before, that the symptom of man could be separable.
Yeah. And yeah, it's definitely, we don't stand outside. It's like all the stuff that we're doing to the earth is affecting it. It reminds me of like Julia Kristeva's Abject, like the jettisoning of something out of your personality, but it's like, or like out of your subject, abjection. Like if we could just like, the earth is this natural holistic thing, but it's really like all the waste, all the pollution, all the plastic in the ocean, all the fact that like marine vessels, military or commercial that produce cargo, they are going to have workers on there. So they have bathrooms, they have obviously fuel and fuel waste. So when you're at a certain mileage, you could literally pump that stuff in the ocean, the CHT, the collective sewage system. So it's just a bunch of crap, piss, and then the excess fuel waste gets dumped to the ocean. And it's like, oh yeah, nature's just homogenous. And it's like, no, like it's literally the product of all our crap and waste that we try to disavow and abject it out of our personality, or just say that it's not there, sweep it under the rug.
Right. And in trying to disavow it, I think we also disavow how we are continuous with nature, because that is an unsettling thought, in that nature itself might have entailed our existence. And to what end? And that's a much more frightening thought, and that like maybe nature itself wants to destroy itself. Maybe it's also driven by the death drive, and we're crazy out there theory. But let's just wrap this part up, and then we'll maybe take
getting too Reichian and Jungian for me with that.
No, I don't know. This is the world trying to regenerate itself via our own suicidal ideation. But speaking of suicide, love is a form of suicide. They have this, I like this little like back and forth, or they get kind of poetic, and they're talking
Mhm.
about how love is suicide and death and mastery. And I don't know if we want to go too deep into love at this point, but it's like we have like love is seemingly, as I understand, it seems to be the most direct conduit to the ideal ego, in a sense where it's like love is obviously symbolic, but it almost seems as if it promises, like as if it would enable you to bypass the symbolic and just get to an originary.
Yeah.
And that's what's so dangerous. That's why it's so deadly.
Especially like in romantic love, that's what it is. Just like it's all a demand of like the totality of the recognition of the totality of my ego, but it's really just fragments. And sometimes it's like, in a sense, like, yeah, love is a suicide, like a metaphorical suicide, because like you literally change yourself in a way that, and I mean, I'm going to use maybe existential terms, but I don't want to get in this thing of authenticity. Like there's this pure self of you, but you mortify yourself more, like, or what was the term used with the fragments? Yeah, you pretty much distort yourself more for this other person. I mean, what is the quote by Lacan is that like love is something that when you give something that you don't have to somebody who does not want it, and you demand that in return, that recognition of it in return, and will literally situate your ego for them in the way that you reference yourself, your mastery. You will literally unmaster yourself in a new form of mastery as servitude.
Which gets right at the heart of what mastery really is. Love, it disabuses you of the regular kind of symbolic dynamic that you might live with in everyday life, and it's something that's highly symbolically charged and yet also feels the most like purely imaginary in some ways.
And we're talking about eros, we're talking about erotic love, we're talking about romantic, and even how like the other aspect of the ladder of love, to use Plato, is mania, like the madness, the obsession that comes with it. And this is like, and we talk about Symposium, I think like the whole aspect of psychoanalytic interpretation of love is Platonic, but not in the sense of like Diotima's like the perfect form of love. It's more in the is it Agamemnon, or the one dude who gives the speech, Aristophanes, I think it's Aristophanes, about right, how the gods made man like with 4 legs, 2 heads, and 4 arms, and then split them in half because they were too powerful. So now they're lacking and they must find their other halves. That is like the in the flesh of what psychoanalysis thinks love is. It's just like the search because we lack the other. So it's in this realm of
all we can give them is our purified lack almost.
Yeah. And agape, which is more religious, would be like not loving the divinity of you, but loving like the imperfection of man, which I think Zizek and like Alain Badiou kind of get at with like Avant, loving as Avant, and Zizek's like approach of like appreciating the imperfections,
which is a very non-Platonic ideal of love, I would say, or non-ideal ideal of love. So here we wrap it up with kind of riddling formulation. Once again, we have the Zeitlich Entwicklungsgeschichte, which is how embarrassed by the temporal relation Freud was. He was so embarrassed, he says, that temporal and history of development. So this is, again, he's asking us to focus our attention on the reconstitution of the subject's history, right? In this sense, it comes out of nowhere. Do we want to take a break now and take this up later and leave this dangling, or is there something you want to say before?
No, we could take a break. We can take what do you want, a 10 or
10,
5?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
8:54.
Yeah.
To Dr. Perrier. What happened to Dr. San Pellegrino?
Oh, shit.
Sorry.
Perrier. You want to be Italian, not French?
So he's talking about this article by Freud where he makes some clarifying comments about dream theory, morbid symptoms, prototypes. As usual, this seems to veer in a direction that's very inexplicable. Like, why are we talking about this now? But
well, yeah,
it becomes clearer.
It becomes clear because remember that the inspiration of this mirror stage, or not the mirror stage, these inverted bouquet, comes out of the fact that Freud had a similar schema for understanding like the perception of dreams. His dream schema, it's like perception, memory 1, memory 2 type thing, different layers. But I think they're like retroactive onto each other.
And Lacan is very adamant about finding the right sorts of metaphors and devices that to explain Freud's theories, because they aren't meaningless. They are chosen whimsically.
And it makes it like more, it brings a lot more emphasis into this, in the fact of like this arbitrary distinction between the in-well and the unwell. Because even like when you look at Zizek, it's like we never escape ideology, because as soon as we go to sleep, we're deeper into ideology. So it's like, you know, we're deeper into the symbolic. You know, we think we could sleep the day away, like, you know, oh, like I feel like I can't master anything, and like, you know, I'm just gonna sleep because like that's the best thing I do. No, you're deeper into your self-destructiveness, because then you see your desires formulate in there, and then you lose that sense of mastery because you have nightmares, and you're just like, oh no, like we freak out more from a nightmare than we do when it in real life. Like nightmares have more grasp, and like I guess that's like pretty much like a dumbed down way of it, like showing the relationship between the dream schema and the optical schema, and the relationship between what we're talking about.
We just experience ourselves with a certain potency and immediacy and intensity that we don't in waking life, and he's going to explain how that is and how it fits into narcissism, pretty much everything we've been talking about up until this point. Narcissism, and also the representation of corporeality in the dream itself. But first he makes it what would seemingly be an aside sort of comment on how a person, to use Lacan's word again, sort of can dismember themselves. How much is dismemberable from us in our physical reality, and what can we say is truly organically pertaining to our body and what isn't. And he calls this the decomposable, collapsible character of the human ego, which, as we were talking about before, relies on crutches, prostheses, and technological additions to, in some sense, realize its potentiality, and that this process of this additive process is part and parcel of what it means to be human.
And it's just really interesting the way he just builds it up, like you do, because like you don't get this in like the at least from like the commentary of like we're used to later Lacan, we're used to like Seminar 11, where it's like, we know what death drive is, that which undermines itself. But it's like all these different comparisons, metaphors, just kind of like make the buildup of death drive even more beautiful and elaborate, to just show like how undermined we are, just like how imperfect we are because of the privileged symptom of the ego.
Exactly.
The symptom.
And it's also cool how he is just right now wandering the corridors of the palace of Freud. You know, because Lacan has the reputation of being somewhat arrogant, maybe like kind of imperious, kind of a trickster. He's provocative, but this just goes to show you although he is very critical of many other thinkers and analysts, he is not at all above defining himself as the disciple of someone else, or just someone who exists as the elaborator of Freud's system. And this shows you just how intimately he is involved with, and just how continuously he inhabited this world. Like, that's what's so incredible to me, is just how carefully he's read Freud. And that's why it's almost, he's asking you, well, not asking you, but it's almost as if he demands the same level of attention. Hopefully we're doing it. Anyway, that's a digression, but the dream, the libido in the dream, how does it manifest itself? How does it speak? We're at the level of temporal regressions. Some of this was a bit confusing for me. I wasn't exactly aware of how it connected with the rest of the arguments made.
Well, there's these temporal regressions. It seems like it's like in the dream, there are always these things which try to formulate, in a sense, what we were talking about earlier about like this wholeness. And to compare and contrast, there is this very similar notion of that in Jungian dream analysis of regressions of certain temporality, but in the dream symbolisms, in the fact that there's fragmentality, but the difference between Jung and Freud is the fact that fragments need to be transubstantiated and integrated into the conscious waking life to create a total self from the past, bringing it into the present day, and to create the person you're supposed to be, to create the archetypal self. But in here, we're talking about the fact that there is these regressions due to the alienation, due to the fact that there's just fragmentation, and desire seeks itself through the other. But it can never get that because mutual recognition is undermined. It's a failure. The death drive does that.
Because also in everyday life, would you say, to take a page out of Heidegger's book, we are caught up in the everydayness of communication that doesn't allow us to metaphorize the other as something distinct?
Yeah, like we can't find a literal other without like signifying it, like metaphorically, it seems like. And there's just always mediation. And it seems like
right
in the Jungian metapsychology, there's no understanding of the dialectic. It just thinks there's these polarities that could come into harmonious unity immediately, like without this mediation of language or the Hegelian self-consciousness. He didn't read his Hegel. He definitely did not read his Hegel. He read every other romanticist thinker but Hegel.
And here we have like the disaggregation of parts that allows us to understand the subject better, because even if we have an inkling that there is this otherness within us that determines our desire, you don't have to read Lacan to come to a kind of realization like that. But again, in everyday life, as you say, this mediation is so active that it doesn't allow for the kind of symbolization that happens in dreams. But I wanted to ask you, what does narcissism have to do with egoism? Aren't they the same thing?
No, because an egoism, in the sense of philosophy, thinks of self-interest and is certain of itself. In fact, it has more to do with rationality, having an intellectual understanding and agency. A narcissism, though it seems like they could be hand in hand, and in some levels there is some form of narcissism in egoism, but narcissism implies a more dupe and lure of making yourself the sexual object, libidinalized, a libidinal investment. And when we're talking about the primary narcissism, there is this fragmentation of an image exterior of yourself, but you identify with that. You have to reify with that in some way. Egoism, in so far as it is like a philosophical term, is like an ethics of like, you have your own self-interest down rationally, and you know what you want for your preservation. But really, no, especially if we have death drive involved. No.
Right. So he wants to relate the two, distinguish the two.
Yeah,
but
and I don't know if it said in here, but I think that it's kind of cool that he says that, because this is like how like naive psychology bros or people that were just like anti-Freud, like anti-Freud propaganda simps, like believe Freud was, oh, he's just this egoist that was obsessed with sexuality. Like, no, that's like, he's saying that the ego is a problem. The ego is not like the starting point of like the solution. That's what we are. Like, it's literally a privileged symptom that we got to look at. Though the ego has its terms of philosophy, the ego is something like that will really undermine itself in looking at neurotics, looking at the perverse, like look at the wolf man, look at the rat man.
What's ironic, and this is something that Ryan Engley and Todd McGowan pointed out in their defenses of Freud two-part episode that I think,
yeah, those are both good. They're both good.
On Why Theory, yeah. Really good. But how people apply Freudianism to Freud in their criticisms of him by saying, oh, well, he is obsessed with sex. He wants to have sex with his mother. Maybe that's his weird hang up. And it's like, he's the guy who pointed out that this could be a hang up in the first place. Yeah. So applying it to him, you're just proving his. Yeah,
you're affirming him. It's like science bros trying to be like, oh, we have no need for philosophy. Science can, like Sam Harris bros, like science is in the business of values, or like, science could discover the truth. That's not a scientific statement. How do you prove that framework of epistemology? Through philosophy.
I want to say something about Sam Harris. The thing that upsets me the most about Jordan Peterson is how much attention he takes away from Sam Harris, where obviously Jordan Peterson, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but obviously Jordan Peterson says more heinous things and is like so much more easy to attack.
Yeah.
But I feel like Sam Harris in his own way is way worse. He's a lot more slippery.
Yeah, he definitely...
He doesn't get enough flack because he's like, he has the coverage of a Peterson.
Did you see their debate that they had like a long ass time ago? It was quite cringe, and Sam is just like, can't believe why he should have to believe in God or even act that God exists. Just, Jordan Peterson's like, it's not that I believe in God or I don't believe in God. I act as if he exists for me to act in the world. Type.
Dude, yeah. They're both such bitches because like they're the inversions of each other, because like Jordan Peterson's like, oh, like he's obviously into everything quote unquote Judeo-Christian, but won't really clearly say I do or don't believe in God. And then like Sam Harris is like, oh, yeah, I'm an atheist, but I'm really into this, Eastern, what Zizek would call Western Buddhism, kind of like spiritualism. So they're just the same. It's just the inverted image of the.
My atheism is to mask my pathological xenophobia of Islam's.
Exactly. It's convenient for me because then I can say I'm against all forms of institutionalized religion, but especially this one.
Yeah, and Jordan Peterson, it's like I'm in the business of values, and I glorify, traditional enlightenment to say the fact that I hate communists and liberals.
In the business of values. We might have to edit this part out.
No, we should not. We should keep that on here. People need to know.
I don't know. It's not taking a especially transgressive stance.
It's not.
At this point, though. But yeah, more German here. We have. I don't know. I don't want to get too caught up on this. We have what's so cool about these seminars is when you have these like one-off characters, you're like, this is what I love about reading these, is it's like only get a vague impression of like who's there, how many people are there, and then it's like it feels like a dream in itself because it's Madame X, can you give us a hint about this? And then suddenly Madame X speaks for what I'm assuming is the one and only time. And she's just like, sometimes Freud uses Viennese words.
Yeah.
And he's just like, it's interesting the significance of the Viennese milieu. Obviously, these people were like the most rarefied, refined of the upper crust in their like pan-European little cultures. They're just like, yes, very far from the proletariat. In every sense of the word. But I just love how like Madame X pops up and it's like, who else is here? Presumably a lot of people.
At least the earlier lectures or seminars prior to what was it? I want to say 8 and 9, and then Names of the Father didn't happen because then he got expelled. But then seminar 11 was the most popular one because that's where like it was open to like I think at least like 300 people, 100 to 300 people. Here is like a small circle. I want to say it's like maybe between 10 to 20 people at most.
You know what's funny is when once we get to seminar 11, we're going to be streaming it and we're going to have 300 people listening in.
Right now, Mikey from Dangerous Maybe is our only hip elite.
He's our Lacan. We're hip elite. But all right, back to the matter at hand.
Gegenbild comes up again.
Germans, if you're out there, can you please tell us what Gegenbild is? Let's learn German. I don't know. I feel like it would help to learn German and French, but that's a major undertaking.
It is. I'd rather start with French.
So, okay, you did a beautiful job of explaining how narcissism and egoism are interrelated, but different. Now, here's where we really get to the heart of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And
reconnaissance.
What stands for méconnaissance in our lived, sentient, waking existence is what can be, and very uncannily and eerily manifested, evoked in the dream, which is this presence of the other, which is us. And I think that's what can make a dream so disturbing, among other things. It's not just that, you know, gruesome things can happen, people can say hurtful things, people can hurt you. It's not just that anxieties and fears and insecurities are evoked, but this sort of depersonalization or derealization can be staged in a way that cannot happen in everyday life. And I'm reminded of, I don't know if you're a Sopranos fan, but
I didn't really get into Sopranos, but I definitely want to now. Like people are making a lot of memes out of Sopranos and
honestly,
commentary
aside, because I don't know, I've seen this series at least 5 or 6 times all the way through. I mean, I think it's the greatest TV series of all time, but it would be relevant to us. Maybe we could do like an episode review, because the main character is going through analysis.
Yeah, I've seen like snippets on that. Yeah, he actually goes through actual like psychoanalysis, right?
Technically, she's an analyst, but it would be also good for you as someone who's aspiring to be an analyst to see what she might do wrong, or where you do things differently. But just even apart from that, it's very Freudian. But I bring it up because there's a specific dream. There's a lot of dream sequences in it, but there's one dream where the main character, where Tony, who's the protagonist, he dreams that he's this like Italian immigrant, like handyman, who is coming to this house in the countryside to like work on something. And for anyone who's seen The Sopranos all the way through, they'll remember this dream. He enters the house and he sees on the steps like this shadowy figure, and it's definitely one of like the more chilling images in the entire series, despite all the violence and everything. But I immediately thought of that dream when I thought of what is being talked about here, because it's like this shadowy figure, and there's all these like, bullshit YouTube analyses of like, what does this dream mean? What do these dreams mean? It's always like the worst, like Psych Bro 101 explanation. Yeah. But I think, to me, that is a exact exemplification of what he's talking about here, where, your other can be encountered in your dream. And it can be a disturbing experience. And your other is your desire.
Yes.
When you encounter your desire as detached from the immediacy, and now we bring phenomenology into it, as detached from the given of your reality, it becomes foreign once more. And I would say that what happens in everyday life is that it's not desire that you fear so much as the otherness of desire that needs to be sublated into something familiar and recognizable. Yeah. So it's like, this is why we need other people, right, to bounce off of and have these imaginary relations with, is to, in some sense, I would say, domesticate desire to keep its foreignness at bay.
Yeah, and I think even the sense is like, not that desire is domesticated, but that libido is domesticated through desire. And that was the Hegelian, Zizek'ian. But I wanted to add to that is like another way of seeing like méconnaissance, because you're bringing up Sopranos in the dream. But like, for instance, it's like we always see ourselves like let's say we're mad at somebody, like somebody that we just don't like at work, or like our boss, like, oh, like, trust me, like if I was just in a room with him and I, by myself, like I deck the shit out of him, just trust me. But then they start having dreams, and then like they're being chased by people, and then they turn around and try to hit the people, but it's like their hits, the occurring dream of like your hits just don't have power, or like you run, and it's like you're running through cement, like you're like concrete. There's the méconnaissance, this misrecognition of yourself.
Wait, explain that a little bit. For what, like the I always like the slow motion punch.
The slow motion punch, where just like it doesn't have any power to it. Like, it's like you don't really hit the person hard enough. Like,
well, it's also a relation with your body, right? Because you can't put the force behind
exactly
the punch that you would want to be right.
You lose mastery. So there's this like, yeah.
Very Zizek-ian. He says something fascinating here, quoting the evangelist, quoting the Bible. They have eyes in order not to see, and that, and I feel like you could bring the what God, what is he called? The not the scopic, but the one of the drives, his the seeing
the scopic drive. It'd be the scopic drive. Yeah, which he doesn't really talk about until seminar 11, I'm not mistaken.
But it also brings in the kind of anamorphosis.
Yes, and I think that the fact that you bring that up, like, and this is why I think like seminar 11 is literally just like seminar 1 2.0, because there's just so much added into it, going back to everything that he's bringing up here about like the 3 registers, the symbolic, the real. But the main thing about the scopic drive is just like that is what would probably initiate this whole thing of the lure and the mirror stage in total with gaze. Like what would make gaze a thing?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that like you have there's this idea of the supremacy of the visual, especially in Western culture, where everything is flooded with light, and light is God and darkness is evil, and to see is to know and to be true, and like there is this collapsing of beauty and seeing and knowing, and the visual as like being the honest and clear directive toward what is meant to be obtained and like united with. But what's fascinating is that here, I think his emphasis on optics also is meant to problematize it, in that you have eyes in order not to see. I would bring this back to the anamorphotic and like, or anamorphosis and the dialectic, in that we know that other senses we acknowledge the partiality of other senses more so. Sound especially is something that we have very little defense against. We can close our eyes, and you can plug your ears,
but you can still hear for the most part, unless you're deaf.
It's like all right, think about the example of Odysseus and the sirens, and he says to plug his ears and like bind his hands, and like the idea, it sound, the voice is much more terrifying because we are far more enthralled to sound because we have less control over it. Touch, well, we could choose what to touch, but everything else feels more partial, whereas what we can see feels like totalizing, right?
Yeah. But sound, we don't have any totality to it, like, without like trying to identify what the cause was, or at least have what is it, the what is it what you were saying earlier about Fernando Saussure and the signifier, about a vocalized sound or something like that, or like a
audio image, right?
Audio image. Audio image.
But of course, it's like, right, the word is orally spoken, but the image that it evokes is is the kernel we would hope to extract from or sublate, like in some sense, from the audio itself. But it's the false totalization of sight that, in some sense, it becomes the basic, like the metaphoric backbone for, I would say, like Western civilization's understanding of the self, or to even, if we want to bring it there, something like Heidegger's metaphysics of presence, almost like a totality, a fullness and exhaustibility, but also like what Lacan is doing in problematizing it, bringing it to its dialectical point, is showing how the lure here is in thinking that the I of science can embrace everything and all things at once, and is also their source in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And here we and okay, after everything I'm saying, can you relate that back to the dream here?
Yeah, like even that, like with the thing of the mastery via the vision and the image, it just makes me think it's like the contradistinction between Western man versus the East, because it's like in the East, especially like the Upanishads, the senses are the sense consciousness is the deception, and the Atman or the self is neither located in the eyes, the sense pleasures of the body, but obviously in the Brahman, you know, but still like the principle of it is the same. As the fact that like we are slaves to trying to get this knowledge through the eye, but the eye is the lure, and even Plato knew this too, because he was a mystic at heart, but yet he still has to rely on metaphors that rely on the sun, the light. You know, it'd be the difference between like doxa and gnosis, right? The knowing.
And I would say, given that, what makes the dream uniquely powerful and so alluring for Freud, for example, is that it almost democratizes the senses in a certain point of view, because it's like, yes, it's still visual, but sound in its own way, and touch, maybe not so much smell, maybe, like they all get their say and blend into one another in such a way that it brings sight, it brings optics to an impasse. And what I would say is that the representation of corporeality as it exists here, as the representation of the other that is our desire, is here contained within an image that is more than an image.
And if you think about it, it makes me think too, like because you'll talk about this in seminar 2 about the image, or a materialistic definition of consciousness. It's like the purpose of the image. And if the ego or consciousness is related to an image, again, this meditation of optics, what makes it objective rather than subjective? Look at a camera, right? There's no image in a camera when you buy it, right? There was no picture taken, but then you initiate the first picture, but it has nothing to do but project outwards to take in and record. But not only that, with these things of like, maybe not even just the camera, but like even a phone too, you could crop, you could add filters, you could distort it, you could literally, like, especially if it's a picture of like somebody, you could take off certain blemishes, certain like acne scars, whatever, you add more on. And that's what's interesting about this, is like, it seems like in the way that the eye is positioned, there are things that could be taken away or added onto.
Well, and that's,
yeah, go ahead.
No, but it's my mind's firing off in different directions here, but it's sort of like what we're talking about here is that, it redounds on the apparatus itself. And that's the whole point of like optics and the camera, when Lacan says that the rainbow is there subjectively, but the camera can capture a subjective reality, I don't think he's talking so much about the rainbow as he is the camera, the apparatus that's doing the capturing. And the whole optical schema is, I feel like, the most important point, or it's all ultimately directed back to Schwarzenegger there.
You know? it's literally Hegelian, because it's like, because we're talking about subjective, it's like, but to purely try to define subjectivity or just subjectiveness in the classical sense undermines itself, because its goal refers back to objectivity. The same thing with objectivity. It has nothing but to refer back to than to the observer who sees it. So there we have dialectics, and there we have mediation of the camera.
And this is where I would say that the optical schema itself, for anyone taken in by the crisscrossing complexities of the way it looks, the way it's laid out, is himself taken in by the lure that is the optical schema.
Yeah.
Whereas the beauty of it is the eye is what you should be directing your attention to ultimately, because that is what you take for granted. Because everything else is initially very confusing. You're like, wait, what's the vase? What's the flower? Where's the spherical mirror? I get the eye. The eye is me. Okay. Yeah. And you pass that over. Once you understand everything else, go back to the eye, because the eye is the most enigmatic variable.
And how many times did you say we are not the abstract eye? And I even
why does he keep saying that? You're like, why is he saying this at first? Because he's saying this is the most illusory.
Yeah.
All of the different parts here. It's crazy. So that's the point that should be emphasized. And I think he's saying we encounter that in the dream.
Yes.
Way. Very complicated.
The
gaze, right?
Yeah. As the Republicans would say, the gaze.
The gaze. If we were French, we would be able to say that word without all the Freudian implications. What did Trump ever say, "I love the gays"? You know, he always talks about the gays, the blacks, like.
Well, this reminds me of just something that Plastic Pills said, like trying to define what the gaze was with Lacan in a live stream, and it's like, well, I think what the gaze is like it's like you are looking through a keyhole of your parents having sex, and then you step back, and then all of a sudden the wood of the floor creaks, and then they look at you, or they look at the door, and you catch yourself in the gaze of them. And someone in the comment says, "What do the gays have to do with my parents having sex? They're perfectly straight."
Everyone's always blaming the gays. Yeah. That's hilarious. So we have something similar going on with the like pre-conscious desire, which anyone who talks about, let's say, the subconscious, like psych. We hate this. This is the kind of thing that, like,
the pet peeve. I hate that term, the subconscious. It's so
a hot bath and slit your wrists because we're in the realm of the subconscious.
I can't stand the subconscious.
What they really mean is the preconscious.
The preconscious, which is still personal. And I think in a sense, it's like, this is the Jungian thing of the shadow, but like, really, it's not the unconscious.
And it's, you know, this is just such a misnomer of a concept, because so many people assume that there's a subconscious, and it's like, it makes people feel like they're badass for realizing that they have been denying certain feelings or fears or whatever, or if someone comes to like a realization about their sexuality, and I always kind of felt this way, they're like, well, you know, subconsciously I realized that I felt like this, but I finally, you know, brought it to consciousness. They think that they're tapping into what Freud would call the unconscious. No. It's something can be suppressed, and you might not articulate it, but it's there, and you kind of feel it, and then you say it out loud, and yes, something changes, and that is important, but it's not realizing something in the unconscious.
And then it's funny because like also in another way, it's like people disavow like capitalism and call it corporatism. It's like corporations are trying to control our subconscious mind by putting in like satanic communist propaganda and making us want to buy more McDonald's. It's like, no, motherfucker, you literally just wanted to buy that right there, and then here you are yelling at a McDonald's employee for not working hard enough.
That's so funny because if they take it back to motherfucking Chomsky and like manufacturer consent. That is a faux delving into the subconscious as like, oh, you think there's one thing going on when you're eating your McDonald's, guess what's really happening? They want you to consume, so they want you to do this because the corporations are like, it always presupposes a subject that takes something as immediate
and privatized,
you know, like, and it's easy to do that, like the dumb fat American who just takes life as it is, and that person does exist, obviously.
Homer Simpson.
But it's like, yeah, the Homer Simpson, whereas like no one avows being a Homer Simpson, but what's disavowed is like, again, what's ultimately disavowed is capitalism in the form of like, even people like, oh, I'm an anti-capitalist. It's like, well, no, you're an anti-corporatist.
Yeah.
Because it's corporations and the greedy 1% that are controlling everything. And it's like the same kind of logic that we're dealing with here. And
because all that masks what's really unconscious, those structural mechanisms, whether that the structure, like Vijay said, the homology of the structural mechanisms that create the commodity are the same thing that create the desire formated in the dream.
And that's why this chapter specifically is the absolute nexus point of sublime object, because here we have the distinction between the manifest and latent content. And yes, in the first chapter of Sublime Object, Zizek is going to draw a parallel between the way the latent and manifest content of a dream is connected to Marx's understanding of the commodity form, and why, again, it's another lure. Even the commodity form on the surface can be misunderstood as like, oh, you think you want this Lamborghini, but what you really want is your father's approval or something, or you think it contains something that's going to make you happy, but it's really just filling a hole in your heart, right? Is what, and it's like, no, the commodity form is not just worshiping objects that are expensive. The commodity form is much more difficult to understand, and as Marx put it, filled with theological niceties, in the way, phenomenologically speaking, it's a kind of given that takes some thinking to get around and behind. And it's the same thing with the dream. If you take the dream as something that it's like, you have the manifest content, I had this like there's two levels. All right, I had this crazy dream, this happened, and then a dog bit me, and then I became the dog, and then the mailman came and I bit the mailman, and then I ascended to heaven. Isn't that a crazy dream? Wow, that's crazy. That's one level. And then the second level is like, bro, I can tell you what that dream means, man. Like the dog is a representation of your dad who like never loved you, and you saw him as like violent, and like that's what people think Freudianism, that's what people think Freud is. It's like it's neither the manifest level nor the latent level. What's important is that the unconscious rears its head at the point at which the two meet. Why was this montage arranged in this way? And also bringing it back to the anamorphosis, where is the blot? Where is the point of where is the anomaly? And as Lacan points out, there's always like, and I think he points it out here, there's always something in the dream that cannot be purely like metabolized in the rest of the action.
Not only that, but like it's just because like when you look at it as like just these individual things of like the dog or like why did the mailman, like when you start to look at like these like fragmented things of the dream, you begin to fetishize these things as if they're like things of themselves that have transcendental meaning. And then you start to get into like New Age thinking of like, oh, it's like trying to like create like a premonition or prediction. But really not even just in the fact of that what's really happening is the point at which the latent and the manifest meet. But in the fact, like, what if the fact that the structuration of the dream intersects with the dream that you had yesterday, or in the other night you had something similar theme, and there is this intersection? It's that as you go to bed, you are not escaping reality, or you're actually entering in deeper into it, into the symbolic, into ideology, and therefore you're reconstructing parts in which the latent and the manifest continually intersect in different ways, in repetitive manners.
Or, Andrew, remember Lacan says earlier in this seminar, the best dream to analyze is the one that is the least remembered.
Yes.
It's a crazy thought. It's like it's strange. It's like the fewer the details, the more phantasmatically invested those details are. And strangely enough, the more they reveal about the subject's unconscious, rather than, like I'm always wary of someone who recounts their dream to me. It's like too detailed. I'm like, how did you remember all of that? Come on. You remember every single little detail. It's like, that sounds fabricated. But when you can't remember much, but just a few elements, that's when you get to the heart of what the dream is.
And that is the point. The point is that you don't remember all of it. Here's the thing. It's like, I think for the most part, what you do remember, everything else is structured like a fiction. And this is also where I think there might be some Jungian and some Lacanian Freudian could argue in the comment section all they want, but I think that there is this kind of connection between active imagination, in which it's like you're not trying to actively remember every detail, you're trying to actively piggyback off of what you can remember via what you don't remember, and create some new interpretation that actually makes you come to an interpretation.
It's about the interpretation.
Yeah. But yeah, it's not like in some pure subjective thing. It's like, oh, like some postmodernists, Jordan Peterson, every interpretation matters depending on what your oppression versus oppressed is. It's like, no. Because the subject can lie, the ego, the analyzant can lie, but the analyzant can also react from an interpretation that makes them realize, oh, this interpretation actually really matters.
It's about what is going to force the analyzant into speaking full speech.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes.
And that isn't going to happen on its own just through, like, this was something we were talking about maybe like a few weeks ago, which is that you could talk about something deep or something important to you or something traumatic without going into full speech. You could have like a script about something terrible that happened to you, or how you feel about a certain philosophical subject, your thoughts on something that isn't just talking about the weather necessarily, but it doesn't make it full speech.
Yeah, definitely not. Just like I was saying, like to an extent, like the other day when we were trying to break down Heidegger, like in some sense, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean full speech, even though we're talking about something different than like, yo, did you watch the fights on Saturday? Or like, how's the weather? But to an extent, like even philosophy has entered empty speech, philosophical theory.
Right. Which is what he's going to talk about right here. It's perfect that we came to this point at the third part of the chapter, because it's like, yeah, that's exactly it. It reminds me of, what's that meme? It's like, while you were out partying, I was studying. Did you ever see that? Like, I was studying Confucius.
Yeah, that's like an older meme.
That older. I'm like dating myself here. I'm gonna talk about scumbag Steve next. That's how old. Yeah, it's yeah, that's exactly it. It's not the content, it's not the subject matter, and that's the other thing. It isn't the content that matters so much. As always, we're in structuralism, so it's the form, and it's like,
or these the relational mechanisms.
Everything we've been building up to now, all the rungs of this ladder are leading to language and the symbol. And I just want to say, this part right here, 3, is maybe my favorite part so far in the whole seminar. I think it's the way he brings it all together is just like, talk about mastery. That's one thing I love about Lacan, is he comes off as like such a master. You're watching a master at work.
Yeah.
And
yeah, what is it? What's that like ad lib like on like every like new rap? Like it's like, hey son, where'd you find this?
Oh, that goes all the way back to like the BET like interstitials though. Like, damn son, where'd you find this? Well, yeah. Actually, there's a YouTube video of that being recorded. But yeah, this is that's where this drop comes in, because this is where it all really comes together. And there's my fucking fire extinguisher.
I thought that was me at first. I was like, oh, I thought I took the batteries out of that thing.
No, I can't fucking reach this thing. I don't have a ladder. I need my landlords to come in and like give me a ladder so I can actually replace that battery. But anyway, little anticlimax there.
Yeah.
So,
well, we're just spitting too much fire right now. That's probably why I went off. Damn, son, where'd you find this?
That's exactly it. Super hot fire.
Yep.
So I don't know where to start. We have the anticipation, the anticipated image. Now, I think the dimension that he brings in of the temporal is something, well, I hope he explains it in further detail as the seminar moves along, because we already anticipated this concept of anticipation, I think, in the notion of like socialized time that he brings up in some early chapters. And it's not immediately apparent how this symbol is related to the temporal, because actually he hasn't talked about time.
And it's something he does talk about in function and field.
Function and field, he puts a lot more emphasis on.
But I think why he's so hesitant is maybe just because he if we talk about what Brian was saying in our discussion about the real being more relevant than one would like to think, and even something that Mikey told me, it's just like the unconscious gets more confusing in the later works of Lacan, especially at Seminar 11, because the unconscious is something that is actually temporal and reoccurring. So I think what is temporal right here will get elaborated as the unconscious that's really temporal and always reappearing.
That's fascinating, because the unconscious doesn't know temporal relations.
Yes.
Is somehow the source of temporality, I'd wager to say. And
it doesn't know no time, but the drive the drive is always located in the real for Seminar 11 Lacan and later Lacan, but in the way that it'll manifest itself in these structures is temporal for us. it's mediated by temporality, I would say.
Necessarily mediated by temporality, but being a dialectic always bears us back towards its opposite, which is non-temporality, under the guise of something.
And what makes it non-temporal is the fact that it's always reoccurring.
Right.
Because what's unconscious, it's not like this unconscious inner world. The unconscious is structured like a language, but what exactly is unconscious that is structuring is drive. Or you'll call it death instinct, but death drive, jouissance, etc.
Because what's fascinating is that, again, it's like we have to mask the repetition, because I think what disturbs us the most is encountering raw, naked repetition in nature, in ourselves, in other people. That when we see repetition for what it is alone, that's something we can't face. That is what, in a sense, creates anxiety.
Yeah.
What I love here is what he says, that a name, however confused it may be, designates a specific person, is exactly what makes up the transition to the human state. If one has to define the moment at which man becomes human, we can say that it is the moment when, however little it be, he enters into the symbolic relation.
Yep.
Boom.
Bars.
The symbolic relation is eternal. Now, I want to ask a question to you. I would like to hear what you have to say about this. And one thing I think it's important to do, and this is why I'm so glad that we started with Seminar 1, is that we have all of the stockpile of concepts already ready in our minds. We know Object A, we know the real, we know Lacan's privileged ideas that as of yet only exist in embryonic form here. But sometimes it's good, before we to jump to, oh, well, the symbol is a signifier, to stick with the vocabulary being utilized in the moment.
Yeah, definitely.
What is the symbol versus the signifier? Is there a difference, you think?
That's actually a good question. I really don't know, because that was also confusing. I wonder if, in a sense, the symbol becomes the signifier later, in which, when we talk about, for instance, in the symbolic order, and then the transference, we talk about, for instance, my obsession with trying to understand what the relevance of de magistro is. I think what he's trying to get at is the symbol as signifier, phallus, objet, whatever.
And this is something actually we were talking about with Brian. And the only reason I asked the question is not so much because I want a clear distinction, but one of the difficulties, but also one of the things that makes Lacan so consistently appealing is the fact that there seems to be this possibility of systematizing and periodizing every part of his thought and every stage. And then there are other points when you can just say, well, the symbol is the signifier. Do we need to make a distinction here? Do we not need to make a distinction? At this point, we're at the level of the symbolic, and I know he already has a concept of the signifier.
Yeah. And I would say that the symbol is the signifier, just because in the fact of thinking about it in the sense of how we were talking about I think it was the end of On Narcissism, where he says that Jung confuses the imaginary with the symbolic in symbols. We're talking about the symbol as signifier, as the signifier par excellence, which the phallus, but it has no signification on its own, but what it signifies, its referential point, or the fact that it's always, as Brian would say, latched on to other signifiers. And the privilege of signifiers versus the signified, we're talking about at the beginning of this episode, the difference between Saussure and Lacan.
And it the thing about the phallus is that it stands for signification itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is the thing that, let's say, like Chomsky Simps thinks about meaning, is that to make meaning is to also stand outside meaning, is to be able to lie. So it's like when we get to what is the symbol, what is the signifier, it's not that which contains information. It isn't just the vessel of information.
Yeah.
Because it has to also be able to say nothing at all for meaning to be conveyed. For meaning to mean, it has to also be able to say what it is not. And this is something that I think it was like Lorenzo Chiesa, my boy,
right,
pointed out that's really fascinating, is that like it's not just about lying. Even animals can deceive and lie in a sense. What animals can't do is pretend to lie.
That's true.
To be able to pretend to lie, which is a very difficult concept that I'm always trying to wrap my mind around it. But you can give something the appearance of a falsehood when it's true. And if you do that, then you are in language. So the signifier is that which encapsulates falsehood as a reality, as a presence. And this almost like has a Heideggerian evocation for me, in that like and I'm just at the very basic level here of like Heidegger, just learning what he's all about, but like that absences have the same importance as presences.
And like we were talking about it, like Derrida being freaking Dollar General Heidegger, it's like really like that too in deconstruction. Like everything seems to boil down to Heidegger, or not everything. We shouldn't reduce everything down to Heidegger. What I'm saying is like the importance of Heidegger's phenomenology of not only just like present at hand, readiness to hand, but referentiality, and the way he used this, that pretty much builds the groundwork for structuralism to exist. It seems like
that. Remember that, like, because I feel like there's a discussion there with like phenomenology versus structuralism, but like as it builds the groundwork, as you say, that's really interesting. But I want to point out here that this also reminds me of Verneinung, where the symbol introduces a third party, an element of mediation. Only through an absence can that element of mediation exist. So it's like, what is the symbol? The symbol is it's not my mother. The symbol is not mother.
The symbol is the master signifier, the phallus, everything that like it needs a referentiality on, and its absence becomes present in what it references. And yeah, you're exactly right. But when it comes to Verneinung, it's only a matter of time till empty speech deforms itself in a performative, and we get closer to something of full speech where it's affirmative.
But what it's affirmative of is that exact dialectical like corner fold where
and that's how I see the empty full speech like dichotomy as something that's dialectic. It's like determines itself.
I think that the empty full speech dichotomy can be easily misunderstood, again, if you're to base it on the content.
I never saw them as separate. I always saw it as like one type of speech that becomes like its own determination based upon resistance. Resistance is the mediation, it seems like. Well, speech is the mediation. Empty speech is the ego trying to mediate these resistances that allow it to perform, but also showcase what is absent, especially when I was mentioning about what was it? What did he reference? J. Austen's How to Use Words.
Right. Yeah. And it makes me think of that what people would say about great musicians. It's like, it's not just the notes they play, it's the notes they don't play. Like, those absences also make up what the thing is. Okay, I think we covered that, so I'm gonna get to this. I like okay, whenever you have like a non-German or French name, well, even the French, you're bound to get someone who's about to be shit on by Lacan. And we have Keller, who's this
Gestalt
philosopher who is like requested to write this text about his philosophy, and it creates this disequilibrium in him. As he says, equilibrium is a Gestalt notion, but basically he's stressed out that he has to write this text, and he's explaining this stress in terms of a disequilibrium which will only be resolved once he's able to discharge this tension through the act of creating this text. And he has, and I think what's interesting here, you could, it's easy to miss, but he's saying that this guy Keller sees himself as an anti-mechanicist philosopher, and yet he's saying that this, like, his interpretation of what's going on in him internally is very mechanistic in the way he explains it, and that, like, he's being, we talk about being wound up, right? Like, I'm really wound up.
Yeah.
I'm really, or someone's like uptight. It's like something is like really, tightened within you and just needs this discharge to be loosened. That's how I interpreted this, as like Keller misrecognizes the source of his anxiety here, and that what Lacan sees as misconception is, and Andrew, let me know if you see this any differently, interpret it any differently, but that rather this other Keller, this contracted Keller, I think we talked about this in the messages we were thinking before, but is being almost interpolated or addressed as something other and other than Keller, and that this disjunction, this bifurcation between the two Kellers, the many Kellers, this realization of like the fragmentary reality of the ego that occurs when someone is called upon to perform a certain task is actually the source of the stress and anxiety.
Yeah, and you were saying like an Althusser way of interpolation, right? Was this the example?
I thought of it as an interpolation because he's
where there is and I think there is interpolation, because that interpolation is the fact is like what makes us subject, because we're subjected to, just like in the way of the trial, the main character is subjected to the law. But what makes the Lacanian way of subjectivity different from Althusser is the fact that Althusser doesn't bring in the point of desire in which we desire this, rather than it's just like, hey, you, and you turn around, but really the cop was talking about somebody who was like behind you or something like that.
But it has that kind of the hail.
Yeah, it has the same hail,
but it's way more. It's way
external repressive apparatus. It's more of desiring.
But I don't. But that sort of socio-political dimension isn't what's involved here.
But so there is an interpolation.
Interpolation of being addressed, because interpolation is also being addressed, and it's. I know that in Daring Leaders, What is Madness, he uses the phrase interpolation as address, and how he explores how being addressed is in itself traumatic. You know, it's traumatic to hear your name. It's traumatic, even in a good like context. It can be very jarring. Oh my God, like my name, you can feel accused suddenly. Like it's almost as if your name is like an accusation.
Yeah, like you're stressed out about like finally, like, you know, you get to see the bride in her gown when you're about to get married, and the priest says your name, and you're just like, what the fuck? Like
that's a good spin.
The most happiest of your time is also the most stressful, and then like also interpolating.
That's interesting you situated in that context, because you know the speech changes you, but also the you know, get the fuck over here is also just as stressful interpolation. You're about to be changed by a word you say. But he says that he misrecognizes or misconceives, different from misconceives the symbolic register here, which is really, and then he uses this really fascinating thing, is that the biological fact of being son to a father is not anywhere near as important as the fact of being called a son by a father, being called a father by a son. Here we get in D&G, because it's like, maybe they would disagree, or they would say that, well, this is where the social dimension of ideology enters into it, but
or the code. They're actually in Anti-Oedipus, they kind of crap on the idea of ideology as critique. They think it's a hoax. It's weird. Yeah.
I can't wait to get to that point. Like, cause who knows? Maybe I'll rethink Zizek, but
no, I think Zizek's way better. I think ideology critique is definitely a lot better than the reproduction of a code, because ideology depends on subjectivity, and they definitely undermine subjectivity. Yeah,
kind of faulty. Like they think subjectivity is too eatable.
Well, yeah, and they historicize it. It's part of the post-structuralism of like the death of the subject. The subject is part of materialistic historical conditions that have a genealogical root. There's no pure subjectivity of structuration, rather that it's decentered by the material socio-political structures, especially with the state.
Yeah, that's why, to me, maybe we can continue this conversation if you have any energy after the conversation, but like it feels like a kind of monism that they're
Deleuze considers himself a materialist monist, if I'm not mistaken, because especially with this influence of Duns Scotus of univocity. We'll finish this after,
because that's really interesting. But this is Mallarmé is a great poet. I've read some of his stuff, and
I want to read his stuff. Yeah,
really good. But this image is so perfect of an effaced coin passed from hand to hand in silence, and I think this is really, it's such an important symbol, because we have to see this is what we were talking about with Brian Becker. We have to see this signifier as a kind of empty container.
Yes.
Meant to contain a kind of emptiness. And the effaced coin is going to be echoed in the image that he's going to, I don't want to spoil it yet because it's so perfect, introduce at the end of this. But think of effacement, an image that was, right? That can be espied only vaguely through certain lineaments, but the pure function of language. And that this is why I think that we play with language, why we do certain linguistic acts, why we interact with each other in certain ways, why we perform these empty gestures, is to act in accord with the pure function of language, as if to only bring about the framework of language rather than what we would think would be the content and the meat of language, as if that in itself communicates something.
Yeah. I definitely agree.
Now, so it's as if all of these different cones, that's how I would describe the optical scheme of various cones, bring about, they all circumscribe a kind of emptiness that functions as the symbol. And the constitution of the subject's history is the sort of like realignment of these specific symbols in accordance with, and this is where I think phenomenology comes in accordance with a almost solipsistic autistic logic of the symbols themselves, if that makes any sense. But that, I feel like we're jumping ahead there.
I mean,
because I say
the
that
phenomenological, yeah, I don't know what you mean about the solipsistic, because I don't really think.
No, go ahead.
I think like more as far as like in the way that you experience it when and it's lived, but not that it's necessarily solipsistic, because a solipsist would take everything to be as produced by like every object that they desire. Every person doesn't exist, but it's produced by their own mind. Unless you're thinking about the Zizek'ian like practical solipsist.
Maybe I'm using the term incorrectly, but like in my own idiom, I was thinking of it more so almost like the distinction between like narcissism and egoism.
Well, I do actually think there are some like and not with egoism, but now that you said that, I actually think that solipsism is like the narcissist trying to philosophize its symptom. Which is something for a later discussion. I think I could make an essay, but I'm like thinking in my head, I think that the solipsist is really just, it's like thaumaturgic, way of grandiosing itself into fruition, where it is the center of the universe and the only universe, and everything else is just like its creation.
Well, I didn't mean so much from a kind of self-reflective philosophical point of view, but more like the symptom.
Yeah. Well, and the symptom is like everything gets its own enjoyment. Yeah, like there is that practical solipsism of that in the Zizek'ian way. It's practical, not like philosophical. So yeah, you're right.
The total closure of signification as it represents the kind of mastery that it overmasters us.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's what I meant by that.
Okay.
And I think what I liked is that this concept of the variations being produced and taking on the variable, the broken, the fragmented, unconstituted, regressive images of the individual, in that it's like you're left with all of these fragments, and it's sort of like seeing faces in a cloud almost, or seeing faces in random shapes, and then it's like the human being always looks for something symbolic in what is just fragmentary, because it cannot accept just a pure fragmentedness of reality almost.
Yeah,
because the symbol always promises something. It's always a promise.
Yes.
As I understand it.
Promise. A bound, a vow.
A what?
I was just saying like bound by a vow or something.
Bound by a vow. Yeah, exactly. The symbol is bound by a vow.
Yeah. I'm just playing on words, but you know what I mean.
And and I think this is the only way to really depict what the symbol is the way he does here, because it's easy enough because you can go wrong if you just see it as something that's like full of content, that is a content. This is again like what Zizek says about like the idea of an authentic self. There's an inner richness, there's an inner contents that must be released and realized. And no, there's only a kind of empty form. Or even the practice of form themselves are vanishing.
I like how he, like, even though I felt like I was alluding to, like, or I was foreshadowing too much in seminar 2, like even right here at the end of this lecture right here, he's mentioning cybernetics about the return of the repressed, or the symptom.
And even, but I want to get to that in a second because it's my favorite part so far. But even, he talks about, he brings up the Wolfman one more time, which is the return of the repressed in the most intense and dramatized way of seeing something that isn't even there, like in a hallucination. And here's where it gets complicated. I still, after all this time studying with them, don't totally understand the return of the repressed and it coming from the future and the future anterior of what will have been. But this part has a place in my heart because it's the second chapter of Sublime Object, where he opens it with this specific metaphor taken from this cyberneticist. I guess he's a science fiction writer. I remember Lacan, Zizek says this is the one time Lacan ever enters the realm of science fiction, or like talks about science fiction writer, which is kind of cool. But this author Wiener posits two beings, each of whose temporal dimension moves in the opposite direction from the other. So like two shapes in eternity almost. Or no, please.
You say that again about the return of the repressed being something about like the coming of the future. Can you say that again?
Well, it's what where does he say? He says it here. Yeah, I'm sorry. Here's where it is. On the other hand, it is something quasi. I'll read this whole paragraph.
Yeah.
If you think you've understood, you're bound to be wrong. You will see the difficulties that this notion of the unconscious gives rise to, and my only ambition is to show you them. On the other hand, the unconscious is, as I have just defined it, something negative, something ideally inaccessible. On the other hand, it is something quasi-real. Finally, it's something which will be realized in the symbolic, or more precisely, something which, thanks to the symbolic progress which takes place in analysis, will have been.
Will have been. And if the return of the repressed is like something that has been and it returns, it makes me think, and because we're talking about cybernetics, or the metaphor of cybernetics, like Terminator wouldn't have been a thing if John Connor hadn't come back from the future into the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Or well, like Dragon Ball Z fans, maybe you haven't thought about this, but would the androids and Cell have been created if Trunks hadn't traveled into the future? Never think about that. He went to warn Goku about getting heart disease, but would any of that have happened if his traveling into the future weren't already inscribed into the past?
Trunks, the real go right there. Future Trunks.
He's known as Future Trunks because I think he actually fucked everything up on the low.
Yeah.
But before we get to the crowning image here, oh gosh, I'm disoriented because I was trying to find where he talks about the real image and the unconscious. Is that? Where is it where he talks about the real image and the unconscious? Yes.
Yeah, right.
This, I was surprised that in all the secondary literature I've read about Lacan that I haven't encountered this here, because I never thought about the unconscious in these terms, but the idea that you're able to see the real image in the virtual image in places, whereas the parts of the real image which can never be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's secondary, or what makes it secondary literature is that you just can't interpret that in that way if you don't understand that. And some people are just not, let's face it, metaphorically inclined. Some people just have to interpret things with as much literal language as possible to dumb it down, but sometimes maybe instead of dumbing it down literally, like just trying to use other metaphors to make it make sense.
Well, it's incredibly impossible to synthesize.
And I feel like Lacan's metaphor game was just on pack. Like if he wasn't a psychoanalyst, this motherfucker could have been part of Wu-Tang.
He could have been the RZA. He could have
the Jizza.
Maybe the Jizza, yeah.
The Jizza. Yeah.
This is the parts of the real image which can never be seen. That is the unconscious. Now that's a crazy way to think about the unconscious. The parts of the real image which we've already established as like the ideal ego, which can never be seen. That in some ways fill out the gaps in the ego ideal, I would venture to say.
Yeah.
And that would be desire, where we see, or no, you tell me.
It's symbolic. Because we're talking about a real image, right? The real, it would feel, or the real would be the gaps, but like everything else, which it would be the scaffolding of the structure itself, would be the symbolic.
Oh no, yeah, but the real image is imaginary.
The real image, is actually just that's that part that escapes that we were talking about with Brian, that could be das Ding or objet a.
No, but up until this point, he's referred to the real image as what you see in the specular mirror directly.
Oh, I thought it up until now, it's that we don't actually have the real image, but it's mediated by a virtual image.
But what he refers to as the real image is before the plane mirror is introduced.
Yeah, because we're talking about a primary narcissism.
Yeah, so that's what I took from this, is that he's talking about the primary narcissism of the real image seen directly in the specular mirror.
And it's like
the concave mirror.
And I think like I could be wrong about this. This is what I'm taking, is that the fact is like this is now understood as retroactively. Like we only understand the real image insofar as we don't have it, because of alienation, of these veils of alienation.
Right, but what this did for me that affected a kind of Hegelian reversal was also that, so we keep talking about the real image as something you try to get at through the ego ideal, and it's there, but it's like it makes the real image itself seem almost whole, whereas like, but the real image, let's say, of bodily mastery also,
like absolute knowledge in Hegel,
pierces through the ego ideal, though, in a way that, like, and these would be but also the blind spots of what we don't want to see. And here's the crest is what we don't want to see in our understanding of the ego ideal.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I see.
That's how I understand. But
no. Yeah, no. I get that. That makes sense. And especially because when you said the Hegelian thing, I was like, oh, like absolute. It almost seems like absolute knowledge.
What do you think it has to do with absolute knowledge?
Well, that would be like the dichotomy. Like Hegel's like, we don't have absolute knowledge. Like everything is mediated, but there are these instances in this like this failure where I guess like what we could call absolute knowledge, which is the split of subject and substance, the deadlock, which can be the real. If we take Hegel as in the way of Todd McGowan, Zizek type Hegel, not of Hegel synthesis of Koja, but when Lacan is not Hegelian, he's his most Hegelian.
No, that's interesting though, also because when I was thinking about the real image up until this point, like I wasn't thinking about the real at all though. I was just thinking of it's like a specific nomenclature for what he's trying. But then again, it's like, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Like to relate it to the real as a register directly.
Yeah.
Too though.
Because that's what I thought the real image was the lost image. Inevitably, as we build up on this, the real image becomes the lost image.
But maybe the real dialectical point takes place at like the unity between the vase and the flowers as the real image.
Yes.
Damn, this got complicated. Okay. All right.
I mean, we're already on the end of it.
I want to wrap this up with what I was trying to outline before, where it's like these two shapes, two ships crossing in the night, two shapes passing each other. One sends a message to the other.
Yes.
For example, square, the being going in the opposite direction will first of all see the square vanishing before seeing the square. Again, this is where Zizek opens his second chapter of Sublime Object, discussing retroactivity, the symptom.
Symptom.
So good.
Yeah.
Read that chapter after reading this, but it was really fun to like rediscover this here. But this is what the symptom is. It initially appears to us as a trace, which will only ever be a trace, one which will continue not to be understood until the analysis has gone quite a long way. Now, the beauty of this is that we're like, oh, but it's a square, right? It's a trace of a square. It's just backwards. You just get the effect and then the cause. That's easy enough to understand. No, the reconstruction, the trace is only a trace in itself. The point of analysis is to reconstruct from the trace a definite shape. That does not mean that the shape is the thing in itself, of which the symptom is only the phenomena.
Yeah.
No. That is it is a reconstruction. It is something aesthetically produced. It is a product of the imagination almost, what the symptom corresponds to, but it's something.
Yeah. No, yeah. That was beautifully put.
And again, this relates to the effacement, I think, of the two sides of the coin. That vanishing trace is similar to the effacement of something that had a certain shape, but when you're more liable to activate your imagination when you have less detail rather than more detail. And then you fill in the gaps there with your own fantasy.
Exactly.
So it's like a good analyst will ask you when you're like, please tell me what this means. What's going on? Why do I feel this way? You know, generally speaking, I feel like they should say, well, what do you think that?
Yeah. And what do you think that means? Exactly. That's like, what do you think? Because it's like, we have the capacity to fantasize or create when we don't think about it. But like, once we have somebody else, like we, and this is part of the being duped, it's like, we think they have all the answers because we realize we're so uncertain. But then as soon as we're put in that position to start associating with it, we come up with all these creative fantasies, imaginations, and that brings the point of the gap and what fills the gap of the real with the protection of fantasy.
And yet doesn't use fantasy yet.
No, he doesn't use fantasy yet. Fantasy hasn't come up yet. I don't know if fantasy actually comes up from what I remember. I don't think fantasy really plays a part yet as it does in I think Seminar 4 has more to do with fantasy since we're talking about object relations.
And as usual, he leaves us with a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
You know, asses on the edge of the couch here. I still haven't shown you why the analyst is to be found where the virtual image is, the counterpart of something that is in itself.
Because this has to deal with what we were talking about apart is like the technique, the papers on technique, transference, the virtual image, everything gets transferred, data dumped onto the analyst. The analyst becomes the virtual image of the plane of recognition. Subject supposed to know, yada, yada, yada. Yeah.
I think that does it.
The quilting points.
What do you say?
That's good. That's good.
Arnold.
Yeah.
Shout out to Arnold up there. You got I've got
Arnold Press. Hey, Arnold was the first to understand about the relation of libido and the physical. He's like in Pumping Iron, he's like, the pump is like coming. It's his Jewish sauce. He's like, can you think about it? I'm coming at home. I'm coming at training. I'm coming in the gym. I'm coming everywhere.
Well, I need to rewatch that. That movie is so good. I'm coming all the time.
I'm coming all the time.
That's such a good movie. Arnold right there above your hat. He's saying, get to the inverted bouquet.
Get to the chopper now. Get to the inverted bouquet. What you waiting for? Alienate me now.
The least alienated guy, and who achieved better mastery or came closer to the illusion of mastery than
it would be Arnold compared to Lou Ferrigno. Arnold freaking did it on drugs, and then he got off of the steroids, and then did it on.
Was he on steroids in that?
Yeah. So he got off. His last time as going up for Mr. Olympian, he went all natty, and he still won.
But in that documentary, he's on steroids?
I think that was like his last one. I think he was actually all natty. I could be wrong, but I think he was all natural.
Oh shit!
Yeah.
Just ruined that movie for me. I thought he was like, oh yeah.
I think he was all natty.
Oh, he was. Oh, that's what it was. I thought.
Because I think that was filmed on his last Mr. Olympia.
I don't know what I've never heard the phrase natty before.
Oh, natural, all natural.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I was
all natty. He was all natty. He was drinking natty daddies.
Love naughty eyes.
Are we cutting it off right here?